Erev Tov. Good evening. I'm Arnie Winchall, the founding president of Ivrit Bamerkaz, Hebrew at the Center. On behalf of Ivrit Bamerkaz, I want to welcome you to Sicha, a series of online conversations on Hebrew. Ivrit Bamerkaz was founded over 10 years ago to bring about a revolution in the teaching and learning of Hebrew. We believe that through a deep investment in our educators and educational system to ensure effective and engaging Hebrew teaching and learning, we will see a Jewish world in which modern Hebrew is not only the language of the state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, but also the language of the people of Israel, Am Yisrael. Our goal in launching Sicha last spring has been to engage a wider audience, appreciating the value of investing in Hebrew and to recruit more of you to be part of this revolution. To date, we have had 7 of these sessions with over 500 participants and an additional 500 who have watched the video recordings. We will be holding one more Sicha in the current series, focusing on the art of translation on February 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. The topic of this evening's Sicha, which will be in English and is co-sponsored by the Jewish Education Project, is Reframing Hebrew in the Jewish Education Space. It is my privilege to welcome 2 esteemed colleagues and educational leaders, Drs. Netta Avineri and David Bryfman. Dr. Netta Avineri is an applied linguist and linguistic anthropologist. She is language teacher education associate professor and intercultural competence committee chair at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies in Monterey, California. She is a co-editor of the 2019 publication Language and Social Justice in Practice, author of the 2017 publication Research Methods for Language Teaching, Inquiry, Process, and Synthesis, and co-author of a recent research study sponsored by the Consortium for Applied Studies in Jewish Education, CASHG, on Hebrew in part-time settings. David Bryfman is the CEO of the Jewish Education Project. David has worked in formal and informal Jewish education in Australia, Israel, and North America. He earned his PhD in Education and Jewish Studies from NYU and has authored several articles presenting broadly on topics ranging from Jewish teenage experience, innovation and change in Jewish life, Israel education, and more broadly about Jewish education. David and I had the privilege of working together in creating what has become the annual Jewish Futures Conference. David is an alum of the Wexner Graduate Fellowship Program and the Schusterman Fellows. I now want to turn this evening's program over to my esteemed colleague and partner in crime, Rabbi Andrew Ergis, CEO of Hebrew at the Center. For those of you who do not yet know Andrew, for over 20 years, he has held leadership roles in Jewish education, ranging from Jewish camp to day school to JCCs and more. He has demonstrated his own personal passion for Hebrew, not only through his professional life and graduate work in Hebrew language and literature, but also in his personal life as past chair of the board of the Council for Hebrew Language and Culture in North America. Andrew, bavakasha.
Arnie, thank you so much. And first of all, Netta, David, I'm so glad that you're able to join us this evening for this Sicha. I look forward to surfacing a number of issues and having the opportunity to hear the 2 of you share your thinking about where we are, where we might be, what are the obstacles that are in the way to get us there, and how we can transform our field. But I'd really love to start I know about you a little bit, both professionally, but I'd love to hear your Hebrew journeys. You know, what got you in the Hebrew game in the first place? Netta, you're an A and David's a B. We'll go with an A.
Good. Thank you so much, Andrew and Arnie and David. I'm looking forward to our conversation, and thank you to everyone who's here with us this afternoon, evening, morning, whatever it is for you. So yeah, it's great to think about this question of what is my own Hebrew journey to make it more personal. So I was born in Beersheba, Israel. We moved to the US when I was 2 years old. Some people, when they hear my name, they assume that I might be, fluent in Hebrew or have an Israeli accent or what have you. And, growing up, we heard Hebrew in our household. My parents spoke Hebrew to one another. So I grew up with sort of a receptive knowledge of the language. But I have never returned to Israel since we moved when I was 2 years old. And so there's been this sort of simultaneous distancing and closeness to the language throughout my upbringing and into my professional career. Growing up, we celebrated different holidays. I heard a lot of different foods in Hebrew and different things from the Middle East. I took Hebrew classes when I was in my undergraduate studies as a way to reconnect with the language. And then during my doctoral studies, when I focused on Yiddish language socialization, just really was continuing my journey into thinking about the role of heritage languages in Jewish life. So this issue of feeling both close to and distant from a language is really what I've drilled more deeply into in my own professional thinking and my career. And to this day, my family, some members of my family speak Hebrew better than others. And I try my best based on the knowledge that I do have. And then of course, I enjoy doing research on these settings and trying to make sense of what things look like in the US context. So happy to share more, but that's sort of the.
I sensed a little Beersheba in your accent.
Sure.
What about you, David?
Yeah, so what are you going to sense in my accent, Andrew?
It's a very strong Beersheba.
Ranana. It's great to be here. Great to be here with Arnie and with Andrew and also with Netta today. Look, if Freud was asking me the question, what's my Hebrew journey? I'd probably be talking about my grandparents who were Holocaust survivors, my parents who were Mitnadvim volunteers in the 6-Day War, and then sent me to Jewish day school, basically partly because of their love and belief in Jewish education. But to tell you the truth, growing up in Jewish day school, and then also in a Zionist youth movement in Habonim, Hebrew was there all the time, and I never really thought about it as being something additional to my overall growth and development. I do remember distinctly in my later years in high school, it was the first time where I met Agnon and Bialik and Amichai and fell in love at that point in time with some of the discourse. But two stories which sort of like tell part of my journey was one, I was in a youth movement and I was one of the guys who sat around and didn't really do the Rikudei Yam, didn't really do the Israeli dancing. And the Madrachim think that I was not really paying attention. And there was one camp, I must have been 14 or 15, and the electricity went out. And the counselors, the Madrachim, did not know what to do. And all of a sudden, myself and two of my male counterparts who had not been participating began to sing the entire Israeli dance tape word for word, each song that we had just been inculcated with. And we knew how to perform all of those lyrics all at once. And it was at that point when now I can reflect on and say subconsciously something was happening to me with this acquisition of a language that was really, really deeply impacting who I was and who I became. But the turning point, I just wanted to add this one piece. In my gap year in Israel, I remember waking up one morning after having my first dream in Hebrew. And that was like something, the light bulb went off that something dramatic had taken place. When you have your first dream in another language, that is something fairly remarkable that sticks with me.
So in one story, the lights went out. In the other, the lights went on. Has either of, for either of you, was this dimension or this encounter, the distancing or the closeness or this sort of organic way it was just a part of who you were, did this inform the choices you then made professionally in terms of these careers you've pursued?
Netta, I'm just going to ask, because I'm fascinated by your story, because my answer sort of questions, not your story, but like posits the question to consider. I don't consider my Hebrew journey separate to my Israel or my Zionist journey, or separate to my Jewish journey. And for me, it was all encompassing. In fact, probably the least resonant element was the traditional Jewish part. My Hebrew acquisition wasn't through tefillot, it wasn't through ritual prayer, it was really through spoken and cultural Hebrew. But I can't distance these, I can't separate all of these. So for me, becoming a Jewish educator, Hebrew was part of it, but not really a major or a dominant force in my day-to-day role as a Jewish educator. But I'm interested to hear how you in your life sort of like is separating and yet entangling these two together as well.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, David, for raising that. Yeah, I think, I mean, the question itself was prompting us to think about the language itself. But of course, all of these different pieces of culture and immigration and family and intergenerational connection and history, I agree with you, are all very much intertwined. I know when I think of myself as like an applied linguistic anthropologist, and I see Hebrew as like a case for the kinds of things that happen to languages in diaspora and through immigration and other nationalist ideologies and things like that. So I see Hebrew as an example of broader phenomena. I've always, and Yiddish as well, even though there are particulars for the case of Hebrew, I've always tried to see, well, how does it connect with other examples of the ways that language functions? So when I think about my own professional journey, to answer your question, I see everything as intertwined in terms of my relationship with Zionism and Israel and my family and our immigration to the US, my family's background, my grandparents. And then I also, in terms of my professional life, try to see how, Hebrew is an example of broader phenomena. Yeah.
It's so interesting that you talked about both sort of this tension between the closeness and the distance. And like, I'm almost hearing an academic answer that question. With this appropriate sort of critical distance. Yesterday there was a great piece in the Times about the COVID, trying to get the COVID vaccine to the elders who speak Dakota and Lakota, because if they're not preserved, the people who can still speak this language will disappear. And I'm kind of push a little. Do you feel like your relationship with Hebrew it's just like Dakota and Lakota? It's sort of another heritage language that, right now is not under threat in the same way? Or is it this language that different members of your family speak? And, it was the language that you first heard as as an infant.
Right. Yeah. And I would love to hear David's response to this as well. But I think from my point of view, the personal and the professional are so intertwined, and you kind of can't see them as separate from each other. In my work on Yiddish, I was specifically interested in what other scholars have called discourses of endangerment. So this idea that like how people talk about a language as being endangered and how that kind of frames how you think about the language. And I think for some people, Hebrew feels endangered to them, for their individual life, for their family or their day-to-day. Even if in Hebrew there are millions of people speaking the language, they may not have access to that. It might feel distant for them. And so, reconnecting, it feels very, very personal for people. Even if it's, in another place, it's fine. Let's say, if we're looking at like numbers of speakers as a way to like ascertain whether the language is okay. So I see it like heritage itself as sort of a belief system that we think about in relation to our own experience. So whether we think something's a heritage language really depends on our own relationship to it, whether we think of it as an immigrant language or a diaspora language. We can categorize languages that way, but it's also very much a personal undertaking that I think is shaped by our own family experiences. But I'd love to hear, David, what do you feel about this whole question around heritage and endangerment?
Look, this is what's
and maybe as like we think about it in the context of Jewish education.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is what's made me so nervous about tonight's conversation. It's not that I can't have the discussion from an ideological perspective. And I brought my little friends along with me. Chernikovsky and Bialik. They're all cheering me on tonight as well. But I can't work out if tonight's a conversation so much about ideology and aspiration. Like, I firmly believe the Jewish people would be better off if more Jews spoke Hebrew. I do. I fundamentally believe that. But then I have to work out, is that actually plausible or possible, and what's the potential to reach that? Look, when I was a kid growing up, my Hebrew teachers would tell us, when the kids were mucking around throwing paper airplanes in the classroom, you have to learn Hebrew because whenever you meet a Jew anywhere in the world, it's the only language that's going to connect you all. And then I traveled the world and started meeting Jews, and the only thing they wanted to do was speak to me in English, including those in Israel, by the way. So that was not going to work. So then the question becomes, like, on an ideological perspective, and as a Jewish educator, I believe there is good reason to learn to speak Hebrew. And I deliberately use those words, learn to speak Hebrew, which is very different to the majority of what's taking place in Jewish education when it comes to Hebrew as a language today. And it's very hard for me to have this conversation about my Hebrew journey and what role Hebrew plays, when fundamentally, and this is probably the conversation we're going to have, the Hebrew that's being taught in America is not the Hebrew that actually you and I and Netta are actually talking about. That Jewish education has decided to go down the route in the main of one type of Hebrew, which is largely, or not really at all, about the question of identity per se, in terms of an Israeliness or a Zionist or a connection to other people. It's rooted in ritual. It's rooted in prayer. It's rooted in text. That's not to say one is necessarily more or less important than the other. But if we're asking the questions of contemporary Jewish identity today, I think it's worthwhile asking the question, what is most salient, what is most necessary? And we'll get down to the nuts and bolts of it all. When we're talking about Hebrew school or congregational school, when you've got 4 hours a week for 40 weeks a year, in a good year, then what are you going to prioritize, and how are you going to prioritize all of that? So I think, we're leading up into the crux of the conversation. I'm not sure how much my ideology is important here. In terms of, I can wave the flag at a certain point. I've also got to be realistic about what's achievable. I think that's the tension that we're going to get into.
We do know that a fundamental enabler of language learning is motivation. So like what for this contemporary, the contemporary community here, what is going to be the lama ivrit, the why Hebrew, that's going to motivate them?
Netta, you want it? You want the first shot at this one?
I mean, Netta, I know you have the advantage of having really kind of taken this out on the road to field test it with a lot of interesting informants.
Right. I mean, I think interestingly, the newer literature on the topic of motivation and language education focuses now on what's called investment in the language. So really thinking about how motivation is not static, or like you either have it or you don't, but that it's more of an ongoing negotiated dynamic thing that you only really know when you're in relation with other people. So when we think about, if we're trying to build investment in the language in the long term, and it's not just, oh, I'm Jewish equals I should care about Hebrew, I feel like it's a different set of conversations, because you could be invested in your Hebrew school, or you could be invested in the camp that you go to, or you could be invested in Zionism, or you could be invested in Israel, or going to Israel, or your family, right? There are lots of different investments that it's a commitment over time that I think what we found in our study was that there's a huge range of investments that, if we're looking at school directors and teachers and parents and the students, that it's important to recognize that, I guess, diversity and complexity of possible investments, as opposed to kind of seeming to narrow it down and simplify it. I think that's an important component that we discovered, was really acknowledging the complexity in the landscape.
So I want to answer a bit differently and say, like, I'm faced with this question all the time, but not Lama Ivrit, like, why Jewish education? So from a broader context, I want to say a couple of things about Jewish education and then how the Hebrew weaves into it. there is an old model of Jewish education, which basically says the purpose of Jewish education is to make more Jews more Jewish, to give them more knowledge and skills so that they can be more Jewish. Well, in today's free market economy, for the average non-halakhically observant Jew, that's not a value proposition that they're going to choose or opt into on their own accord. Now, they might have this carrot of the bar mitzvah, which they need to accomplish in order to achieve it, and that might keep them in there as the extrinsic motivation. But when you're talking about intrinsic motivation, which is the essence of all good education in so many ways, the answer that it's good for you to do something because it is good for the Jews or good for the synagogue or good for some other entity is not actually enough of a motivation. So when I talk about Jewish education, we say the purpose of Jewish education has to be that Jewish education will make you or help you develop into a better human being. And Jewish has to be able to contribute to you being a better human being. And in that regard, I'd say the same for Hebrew language. Hebrew language somehow has to be able to create or develop or cultivate better human beings. Now, the good part about this equation is 93% of Jews in America are proud of being Jewish. And when you say you're proud of being Jewish, it means that you have an affinity to your heritage, your culture, your tradition in its broadest context. Our job, and I think the job of Ivrit Merkaz, is to try and say Hebrew language has what to contribute to that pride. And if we can't do that, then the enterprise falls apart. But as educators, our job is to create a Hebrew curriculum, training, whatever it might be, that somehow answers the question of, in order to be a proud Jew, Hebrew language ought to be considered an intrinsic part of that development.
Netta, does that track with what you've learned? How would you add some color?
Yeah, I mean, I think what David is saying about Jewish education contributing to people becoming better human beings, I think that we didn't actually explore in those terms. So it wasn't necessarily something that we found in our study. But what we did find is that that it seems anyway that Hebrew educators and those in the Jewish education space are really hungry for more teacher training, for more workshops, professional development, connecting with one another in communities of practice. And so it would be interesting to explore a little bit more today what that would look like. What does train the trainer look like? What is educating the educator? All of that. And I know obviously, David, you're completely immersed in this day to day, but I'd love to hear more, because I'm in the language teacher education space, but in a broad sense, like looking at what are the methodologies and the approaches and pedagogies for language teaching more broadly. So it would be interesting to think about, and what do we think of as what is a better person? Like, does that connect with issues of justice, and what does Judaism and Hebrew have to say about that? So it would be interesting to explore, because we did look at this question of collaborative visioning in a particular context to decide what your goals are. And if David is talking about the goals of Hebrew education being about making better people, then what does teacher training really involve? That I'd be interested or curious to discuss further.
David, you're on mute.
I think the issue of teacher training is going to come up quite a lot in this discussion. I think it's really important. Look, everything we're saying here today can fall apart if there's no one to actually do the teaching that we're talking about. And we have to look seriously at who the pipeline of Jewish educators are that's going to do this teaching. Look, a couple of things about Jewish education and Hebrew school or congregational school specifically. One, it's an easy target. It's an easy target to blame, and it's an easy target to criticize. And I want to be really upfront and forthright and say, especially now during this pandemic year, that our Jewish educators across the board have been nothing but heroic in terms of what they've been able to do, what they're attempting to do, the creativity and ingenuity that they're showing. Only credit for all of them. I do also then need to say, though, that Hebrew language, we haven't had enough sufficiently trained educators in America for decades to be able to teach Hebrew in a way that that our students require and demand. Just because you're Israeli doesn't make you a good Hebrew teacher. And We have an opportunity, however, to help Israelis become better teachers in our classrooms. We have an opportunity to train Americans who want to be Hebrew teachers to be better Hebrew teachers. We have shluchim and we have shinshinim in many communities who can do some of this work in a fun and dynamic way. But, you know, this is not front of the classroom stuff, the didactic teaching of a language as we know it. There are some really exciting things taking place when good educators are given good training and good curriculum. It'd be negligent of me not to talk about things like Hebrew through movement, a whole new way of revolutionizing and enacting Hebrew language through kinesthetic learning. There are ways of doing creative, good Jewish education and Hebrew education. You know, to call Hebrew language teaching a failure in America, I know some people call it that, it's a bit rough. Have we created a generation of fluent Hebrew speakers? Well, that's no, but there have been many cases of many people being able to acquire Hebrew in a really interesting and sophisticated way. And I'd say the most important thing is get them really excited to want to continue that Hebrew journey at other stages of their life as well. So it's a complicated story, which is too easily simplified sometimes.
One thing that we found in our study was that the students actually had very positive feelings about Hebrew school. I mean, their affective connection to the language was quite high, and in some ways surprising to us how many students felt that way. So just thinking about what you're saying, David, about how to, I guess, build on that, or let's say capitalize on that in some way to recognize, like, what are they happy about? What are they excited about? What are they enjoying? What is less engaging? I mean, I think some of the work in, you know, Hebrew through movement, as David mentioned, Onward Hebrew, that's trying to either move away from decoding or at least move it into a later phase. You know, those kinds of questions we want to be thinking about like, how can we build on what students are enjoying and what's going well, and to recognize what is happening, and then move towards goals that resonate for the people in a particular context.
Netta, can I ask, like, why call it Hebrew school? Like what's the, is that really what's taking place at the moment? And is that more of a historic remnant, or are we serious about calling it Hebrew school, or should it be called something else? I mean, your study reflects that, but I'd love to hear your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we were trying to encourage everyone to think about, I mean, we were being a little bit provocative, I suppose, in our title of our report, you know, to say, let's stop calling it Hebrew school, to really, I guess, push people to think like what you're saying, David, about what is happening, what's not happening, what should be happening, and let's decide, instead of continuing to call something, you know, a term that it doesn't really resonate for people anymore. I would argue that I think each context should decide what they're doing and what their goals are in a particular place, so that the directors, you know, the administrators, the students, the teachers, the parents, to go through this collaborative visioning process that we talk about in our report, to really ascertain what are the goals, what's feasible, who are our teachers, who do we need to recruit, what kind of education needs to happen for them, that can then filter down, and to really, moving forward, think about, you know, what do we want to be happening here? For some places, it might be Hebrew school, if you define it a particular way. And for others, it might be something else entirely, Jewish school or Torah school or something else that we haven't even thought of. I know some contexts, like Nikki Greninger, Rabbi Greninger, who was, you know, part of the co-author team with Sarah Benor and I, you know, they call it J-Quest, you know, at her synagogue. So, you know, to just really think through what are the particular contexts, and I guess the field would have to decide then what's the overarching term. But as an ethnographer, as an anthropologist who tries to make sense of what's happening in a particular place and recognize that, I like to think about how it can be diverse depending on what happens in that place. What do you think, David?
Well, I'm going to say something like, here's something a bit sacrilegious and, like, you know, counterintuitive to my job in some ways, is that, look, any education system whose purpose is to maintain kids in a system in order to have a bar or bat mitzvah, like, that's not going to work long term as an educational program. So, look, if the reason you're having a Hebrew school is to graduate as many kids to have a bar or bat mitzvah, that's one thing. But I got news for you. We just discovered during this pandemic, we can actually teach kids how to recite the brachot and the maftir for the bar or bat mitzvah portion in about 6 to 8 weeks on Skype if we needed to. So if that's the purpose, we now have a more efficient way of doing that. I'm not saying that's a good thing, by the way. I'm just saying that's what we can do. What I look at now, if I've now taken 4 years of decoding Hebrew in order to get that and put that into 6 hours or 12 hours of instruction, I've now opened up the possibility of what 4 years of Jewish learning can become. And if I'm now able to open up and say the average kid is going to have 2 to 4 hours a week for 4 or 5 years of Jewish education in a supplementary school or complementary or congregational school environment, now that I've liberated myself from teaching a language that is not going to be used, i.e. ancient Hebrew or Tefillah Hebrew or prayer Hebrew by the average kid in America today, now I have a possibility to open up the door of what can be spoken. Look, if a kid wants to learn Tefillah and how to recite prayers in Hebrew, they should do so. If the family wants them to do so, they should do so. And summer camps have proven they can do it, and they can do it really, really well. But I remember going to a tour of a Hebrew school a couple of years ago, a lot of Reformed kids who really knew how to say mincha. They really knew mincha very, very well. And by the way, so did their nannies. And I was like, looking at this situation, I'm saying, this is, on one hand, it's beautiful. And on the other hand, it's absurd that that is becoming the pride of the recognition of what this Hebrew school was demonstrating as the acquisition of knowledge after a certain period of time. No offense to mincha. But the reality of what now happens is I think that our Jewish education can be so much more, and that's the opportunity that's before us now. One word about the pandemic, because I think it's like, you can't hide from this. I don't think the pandemic has created any new problems in Jewish education. It's exacerbated or shined a light on many of the pre-existing conditions. And I think now is a time for us to be able to take stock of one of the problems of our complementary or our non-day school, however, part-time Jewish education sector has not been lack of imagination, has not been lack of creativity, not lack of dedication. It's actually a mission. The mission has to actually change. The mission is no longer to perpetuate the type of Jewishness that always was, because that's a misnomer anyway. It's actually an enterprise of creating the type of Jewish community that we want to be and that we want to be living in. And if we today decide that Hebrew and spoken Hebrew should be a part of that future, we should make a commitment together. That's what we all want to do. The reason it hasn't been successful to date is all about no one prioritizing it, except for a couple of crazy folks on this call. Right? But that's how revolutions begin, right? You need a couple of crazy folks to take something and to run with it. And I think that's the opportunity and the challenge.
So let me pivot in honor of the pandemic. We'll also use the word pivot because it's a webinar. With the two of you coming, one of you coming at this both with passion, but from a practitioner and academic, if on one end is sort of this minimalist decoding utilitarian in order to dead end at 13, and at the other end is Jewish life is deeply enriched by those who speak Hebrew, sort of what is the sweet spot? I know in the research, you use the phrase, building a meta-linguistic community. I'm kind of curious, how do we unpack that? Is that the sweet spot? And what then motivates somebody to say, I want to stick with this and do things later on in the arc of my educational growth, my Jewish growth, my Hebrew growth, where I really have the time to really acquire this language? Like, what's the sweet spot? How do we do this?
So yeah, I appreciate the question, Andrew. I think, my work on metalinguistic community now for the past decade or so, this idea of a community that cares deeply about a language and is very attached to it and values it, and is socialized into ideologies that really, are connected to the language. It grew out of my research on Yiddish language socialization in the US and all kinds of different contexts. And at the time, I was doing a descriptive model, trying to capture like there are a lot of people here who care deeply about a language, but many of them don't speak it. So there aren't models out there that really can capture that. So that's where it came from originally. And now more recently, in my work with Hebrew and collaborating with Sarah Benor and others, is to think more about metalinguistic community, not only as a descriptive model, but as a prescriptive model. So as something that we're trying to build towards, and that goes beyond, just phrases here and there or knowing rituals occasionally, but to really, how do you build a community of people that care so deeply about a language and then actually manifest that care through engagement, support, resources, building a community of educators who can then socialize one another and students into users of the language. So I think to answer your question, sorry, David, about the sweet spot, I think first is really cultivating a metalinguistic community as a step towards, creating users of the language, I guess is how I would put it. I don't think you can do that without first building the metalinguistic community.
I think I like Netta's answer better than mine. But look, education and Jewish education has always been this tension between what the educator thinks the kids should know or ought to know and where the kids are at. And we sometimes look at this as a false dichotomy. Yet we've all been in environments where someone stands at the front of the classroom or the lecture theatre and basically talks at you for an hour, believing that they hold all the information, and you, those empty little vessels, need to be filled with all of that stuff because that will make you a better human being if you know just a bit more, like the expert at the front of the room. We've also been in those environments when content has not been top of anyone's radar. And in the teen world that I work with, we just give the kids hormones and pizza and we know they're going to be happy. But education has to be, in its best form, some nexus between what Mike Rosenack of blessed memory at Hebrew University used to call authenticity and relevance. And it's somewhere in that sweet spot where you meet the kids where they're at, but you're also taking them on a journey. The quest for Hebrew language, I don't think we've quite worked out where that sweet spot is. And we've still been more at this authenticity side of the spectrum, which says you need to know more dikduk. Look, if I have to learn another PL, PUL, NIFA, like if that's where Hebrew language needs to be going in a Jewish environment, that's nowhere near relevance. But the trick with relevance is really important. People don't even know what questions to ask. And therefore, the role of the educator is not to answer their questions, but to make people curious enough to want to investigate questions they haven't even thought about. And that's the difficulty. When people say, go reach them where they're at, it's very easy on Maslow's hierarchy of need to meet people where they're at. But that's not the purpose of education. The purpose of education is to find where people are and bring them on some sort of journey. Camps have worked out how to do this, by the way. They create an insular bubble where they're able to create their own cultural environment, and the sweet spot is the actual environment itself. But we can do better in Jewish education in helping all of this as well. There's a question about Israel, which I think is worth
I'm actually
going
to, with your, I want to open it up. We have this is a Sicha, and we want to involve everyone in the conversation. I see some people have already started posting some questions into the chat. So what I'll do is as I see a question, and we're going to actually start with a question that Sheldon Dorff posted pretty early on. I'll spotlight you, turn off your mic, ask your question, and we'll let our conversants respond.
Turn on your mic, actually, not off.
Yeah, turn on your mic. Thank you.
I
Sheldon.
think I asked.
What Hebrew do we want to teach?
That's right. What Hebrew do we want to teach? So I ran a 3-day-a-week Hebrew high school in LA, and that was the first question. And they were using Ivrit Chaya. We used to call it Ivrit Goseset, but it was a deadly book with no explanation. So we asked ourselves, what Hebrew do we want to teach in the 7 hours, of which not all of it would be Hebrew? We figured out we were going to have 3 hours of Hebrew, but we were going to link our Bible study to the Hebrew with the kids were learning, which essentially gave us 5 hours of language content, language connection, and built into the, and we decided with Arnie Band, who was our advisor, Zichrono Livracha, that we were going to teach, we decided we were going to teach classical Hebrew, but with modern stories. And that turned into the Shlav series, which somehow is still being used. Nobody's written it. There are other Hebrew texts, but we had to decide that. And we figured for our teenagers coming out who were willing to give 7 hours a week, there are hardly any more Hebrew high schools that can even manage, 4 hours a week. That was what we were going to do. So the question today is, what Hebrew are we really going to teach? And somebody said we have to decide, with the collective, and that's true. It's not just the kids, it's what are the parents willing to bear. And all this talk about, oh, we can interest them when they're 3. Yeah, you can interest any kid who's 3 in almost anything. But by the time they're 12, forget it. It's not going to work that way. So, and we're siloed. I think we're so siloed. If we had a program that could connect summer camp with the Hebrew school curriculum, we might have a shot, because we'd have like a summer camp could give you another semester of Hebrew in the same year. The kids are getting their 12 hours, 15 hours of real content in Hebrew, because it's 30 weeks. It's not 40 weeks anymore anywhere. Sorry.
So, no. Sheldon, it's obvious you have a lot of experience and passion. I'm wondering, thank you for kind of framing. David, Netta, would either of you like to take react?
Well, I'll just adjust a couple of reactions, and thanks again, Sheldon, for providing some context. I think what we found in our study is that depending on the school, some schools are doing more modern Hebrew, some are doing more textual, and some are changing directions and deciding to focus on one or the other. I think what you were describing actually is precisely the process that we encourage in the study, which is that to really think together, what are the goals in this particular place? And I would argue that as a collective of people who care about Hebrew and Jewish education, that's that process of how should that look, and how do you make these decisions, and what are the options, and what are the resources, and which textbooks can you use, and all of that is this relatively untapped treasure chest of possibility, that if people were really talking about what approach did you use, how did you make these decisions, that is, I'm very interested in, is the process, as opposed to me as a researcher or as a teacher educator saying everybody should be teaching this Hebrew, but that let's actually think about what do these processes look like in order for us to make collective decision making. And that's not meant to sidestep your question, but just to acknowledge that each context is so particular unto itself. But I'd love to hear David. Yeah.
No, I was going to, firstly, I've got to say hi, Shelley. I mean, I don't know if you remember me, Shelley, but you're one of the first educators that I met when I came to America who opened my eyes up to even this beginning of this discourse. So it's just good to see you.
I absolutely remember you.
Excellent.
Love your work.
Your question is spot on, Shelley. It's really, look, it's real. I'm going to give a really unsophisticated answer in some ways. Like, what happens if we decide here are the 1,000 Hebrew phrases that we want every kid in America to actually learn? I don't make up 1,000. I don't care how many. And we just say, these are the contemporary phrases in the Hebrew language that we think that will help unite, unify, diversify the conversation, and go from there, and start the conversation going. So we're not actually teaching, we're not teaching the language as it's been taught. We're teaching the language that we want to see perpetuate. And I think the emphasis on the spoken piece, that's the exciting piece for people today. The communication, to be able to leverage the technology, to be able to bring people together in conversations together. Look, it's a utilitarian vision of why is Hebrew language important? Because it can help X, Y, and Z. We have to announce what X, Y, and Z are. I think Hebrew language is important. but it needs to be a radical shift in curriculum, because Shelley's completely right. The hours, the simple dosage hours do not exist. But shame on us as a community if our Jewish literacy equation is you either go to a Jewish day school and that's what you get, and everybody else receives some sort of substandard form of Jewish literacy, and there's nothing in between which can be bridged. That's on us as a community. And we have to work out a way that Jewish education is not just about day school and engagement, but there's something meaningful in between, and Hebrew language must play a role if we believe it's that important in that in-between space. Yeah.
Look, and we know there's plenty of work to be done around Hebrew literacy in the day school space as well. What you raised, though, really, Miriam Ebsworth has, I think, a very interesting question at this particular juncture in the conversation. Miriam, do you want to unmute yourself?
I'll even start my video. Hi. Yeah, I actually went to Beis Yaakov, and I had a modern Orthodox mother and a Marxist father. And I'm a native Yiddish speaker. English is my second language. And part of my family's Argentinian, so Spanish is one of my heritage languages. So I think I went into the field of linguistics for therapy. But I've been and now I'm very active member of the Reform movement. I read Torah at my temple and play the piano for a Shabbat morning service. And I am fascinated by all the many possibilities that Hebrew kind of anchors in terms of religious practice, and an enormous range of religious practice in terms of culture. There is a local movement where I live, as well as 3 temples in my town. I live in South Orange, New Jersey. There's also a kind of an ethical culture movement, and then there is a secular humanist group that uses Yiddish as well as Hebrew. And I've been fortunate enough to have done some consulting for the Hebrew charters, which is where my question came from. And I just found it absolutely fascinating, because there were all these kind of Latino and African-American kids with the Jewish kids, all learning Hebrew from kindergarten, you know, very much in kind of an immersion bilingual setting. And one of the things they explained to me, which made me think differently about Hebrew, was that they were using the language and culture. They're not allowed to use it for religious purposes, but to introduce a broader community to Jewish and Israeli culture. And they had a social studies curriculum where they had a little imaginary village. And in this village were families. So there was the Ashkenazi family, the Sephardi family, the Mizrahi family, the Druze family, the Arab Christian family, the Muslim family, and each one was presented as part of the kaleidoscope of Israeli culture, all unified through the use of Hebrew. And I'm also very interested in the Givat Chaviva movement and the use of Hebrew as a unification, rather than only as part of a path to Judaism, but also as an ancient, modern, literary language with all these different dimensions. So I just thought it might be interesting to hear all of you talk about this kind of broader notion of what Hebrew can do, as well as being a Jewish language.
Miriam, thank you. Any thoughts on sort of where in particular, the charter schools play a role in this discourse?
Well, I will say that Sharon Avni, who does active research on Hebrew charter schools, is on the call, so we could very easily ask her to speak about this, because she's doing really great research focused on this area. So we could ask that in just a minute.
Sharon was my student, by the way, at NYU.
See, it's all connected, right?
We're all in the family.
Yes, perfect. So, I mean, I was just going to mention that, I mean, in my research on Yiddish, there were students from various backgrounds who were choosing to take Yiddish classes, just as an example. And that is where I really started thinking about, or continued thinking about, heritage itself as an ideology to which you may or may not, affiliate. So this idea of whose language is this, and how do we cultivate those who may be interested in the language who don't necessarily have the immediate heritage that we envision. That I think is a fascinating conversation, and it connects with all kinds of different phenomena in linguistic anthropology, and like, whose language is this? Who's the authentic user? How do we expand our communities of interest? And who gets to decide those kinds of questions? So I think, yeah, Hebrew charter schools are a really fascinating space in that regard, because you get to see students for whom one might be considered heritage users, and students for whom the language is something brand new. So I just think it's a fascinating and rich space to explore, the connections that don't necessarily have to relate with Judaism per se.
So I really do not want this comment to be taken out of context. I totally respect and admire the Hebrew charter school system and the work that they are doing. That's the caveat. But if you're asking me as a Jewish educator, as someone who cares about the future of the Jewish people, for us to separate Hebrew language from Jewish religion and from faith and from culture and from Israel and from Zionism, that doesn't make any sense to me. I cannot understand Hebrew literature without understanding Jewish wisdom, Jewish faith, Jewish values. So I understand why the charter school system is doing what they're doing. But for us in the broader context, specifically if the focus of tonight is on supplementary or congregational schools, no, it's a major mistake for us to separate the two. When I read Bialik, it's because I understand Tanakh that Bialik means so much, or the poetry of Rachel Alea means so much to me when I'm reading it. And to separate it, I think, is a real mistake. No, we need to get the right balance. But no, the two are entwined. I'd say it again. Good Hebrew education is good Jewish education. And I add one thing. Good Hebrew education is good Jewish education, is good education. And all of it needs to be at a certain level and talking to one another. We should not be making a distinction. I can't see how that is going to be ultimately, as my grandmother would say, good for the Jews.
Can I just have a follow-up, if I may? Is that okay, Andrew?
I'm going to. We actually have a list
Sure.
of folks, and I want to encourage everyone else who's put questions in the chat. Even though I have a sense we have a great group of chevre here, we all like to form our put out our questions in the form of a long lecture. So I want to encourage people to. Joel, we're going to turn to you. I know you had a couple of questions. If you can pick the biggest gem, then we'll have an opportunity for everybody to share.
Thanks. This is mainly for David about things you've been talking about. And the first you've already mentioned just now. One of my questions I think you answered. But if the goal of Hebrew education is to be part of a broader education to make better human beings, if that's the paradigm we're in, what is feasible in terms of what we can do with Hebrew language? And the second part of it, which really relates to it, is there something else that would be feasible if we would have different goals, and what those other goals might be?
Yeah, I mean, this is the essence of all of the work that we're doing at the Jewish Education Project in terms of changing the whole paradigm of how we look at the outcomes of Jewish education. Look, I would say that language acquisition in and of itself is a valued skill which people would like to actually pursue. And if we're able to create that sort of model, that is actually something which people would gravitate towards. I think we're yet to fully understand the global nature of the Jewish people and technology's role in all of that. And therefore, if we can really reinvigorate and refacilitate the conversations that could take place in a mixture of Hebrew or English or Hebrewish or however Sharon Avni wants to frame it, I think in some language, we can bring these conversations together with Israeli youth and with youth from around the world as well. I think that's a really important piece of the equation. And I think there is something taking place generationally now, and this is the global world we live in, Israeli culture, whether it's television, music, poetry, hip hop, is actually cool. And it's actually aesthetically pleasing and actually identity enhancing. And if we are able to articulate and capture that in a way, that can speak to our youth in ways that the Eurovision of 1977 didn't quite resonate in those days. I don't want to disparage Hallelujah, or a Bunny B, but it's not the same as being exposed to some of the music and now some of the television as well. So I think there's a cultural opportunity in a moment. I think people are always going to ask what's new after the pandemic. The recognition in education that technology is here to stay and how we can harness it. It's not our enemy. It's not our distraction. That'll be the greatest opportunity that we're able to leverage post-pandemic as well.
Thanks, David.
Netta, did you have any thoughts, reactions?
Sure. I guess something that keeps coming up for me is I guess this lamenting of not enough time. This constant well, there's just not enough time. Like, how could we possibly encourage students to learn the language? In the field of language acquisition, and language pedagogy, there's a whole field that focuses on what's called content-based instruction or content language integration. And so really learning the language through learning other kinds of content. And so if everything that's happening in Jewish educational spaces were framed as Hebrew learning opportunities, then actually maybe we have much more hours than we're giving ourselves credit for. So if we kind of flip the script to think about content language integration, and then also to David's point, then you couldn't go to a charter school and learn the language stripped from the cultural context and the history and the making sense. You wouldn't just learn, the Hebrew roots. You would have to actually understand all of the poetry and everything underneath that. So you would learn the language through the poetry and the music and all of that. So just to say that there are frameworks in language education for thinking about this. And I appreciate Joel's question about what does this paradigm look like? And there are just some really interesting models for this in other languages as well.
Karina Rock had a question. I don't know, Karina, if you also want to turn on your video, or if you just want to unmute and ask your question.
Hi, I think I just wanted to pop Israel out there and say, because we hadn't spoken about it yet, and I feel like you guys have kind of talked about it a little bit. And so I'm retracting my question.
No, I think it's Karina. I appreciate the question, and it was in my notes to somehow weave it into the conversation today. How do we talk about Israel in general is a really important question in Jewish education. How do we not reduce Israel to a mythical land of oranges and milk and cows and all of those things that I don't think anybody really does anymore, but that's the perception of bad Israel education, although Yom Israel in many a Hebrew school and many a summer camp might still look like that plus a Gadna experience. So we need to address the sophistication of Israel education in general in North America, and there are people doing a really good job of that. And at a particular age, and I'm not going to say what age that is, but at a particular age, that includes discussing some of the things that might be uncomfortable or unpopular about Israel. We have a generation of non-Orthodox, socially progressive human beings who have translated those values to the way they look at Israel. So, well, big shock. Don't be surprised if they don't agree with all of the actions of certain governments in Israel all the time. So we can't avoid that. So Israel is complex for Jewish youth today, and to ignore it that's just an embarrassment in of itself. That a kid finds out about these warts and all when they get to college campus for the first time, that's on us. The question is, how does Hebrew language now fit into that conversation? I think, we should be talking about Hebrew language as not just the language of Agnon and the high language. We should be talking about street Hebrew as well. And you can't talk about street Hebrew without talking about street Arabic. And I think we should be talking about, when we talk about Hebrew language, we should be talking about all of the complexities of a modern language. And if we're going to be big on Israel being a melting pot, which I know is not a really great term, but a multicultural society of Jews from all around the world, That's part of the brilliance of the country. That's part of the amazing Zionist dream. And let's just acknowledge it. Like, the revival of the Hebrew language could be the single biggest innovation the Jewish world has known for millennia. So we should celebrate it, but it's not a simple story. It's a complex story. But again, all Israel education should be a complex education. I think Hebrews, that part of the discussion is complex, but don't avoid it. I think we should embrace it, because kids, if I know anything about middle school and high school age kids, they love complexity and they love challenge. And if we can offer them an authentic challenge, then they're up for that. They're a lot smarter than we give them credit for.
Right. I would echo what you're saying, David. I mean, if we look at education right now and the kind of reckoning that's happening about what curriculum does and does not address, and which histories are not included and which voices are foregrounded. I mean, there's huge conversations all over the world about this right now, right? So if we actually acknowledge that in relation to who can be telling these stories and which curricula we're including and all of that, I think I absolutely echo what you're saying, David, about acknowledging that complexity actually builds students' critical thinking skills, which is a huge part of what we're looking for in education more broadly. So I'm there with you, David, about really also, alongside everything we're talking about, really reconceptualizing Israel education as well. Yeah.
So we're going to have one last question. You should know that when you mention somebody's name, they show up in your webinar. Sharon is eagerly participating, but may or may not have informed me that she's in her pajamas. So we're not going to hear from her. But I know, David, you also referenced the extraordinary work that Nechama Moskowitz is doing. Nechama, you want to give us your last question?
Sure. I guess if I'd worn pajamas, then, maybe I wouldn't have been called on. I don't know. I'm just wondering about, first of all, there's a lot that we have slipped into related to really needing more time to do what we do than what we have in part-time synagogue education. So I just bring that up. And the other disconnect for me, I suppose, is related to Israel or peoplehood. I keep thinking about the idea of a meta-linguistic community and feeling part of this bigger people, but understanding that millennials, and I don't know about Gen Z, are not really into that, and Israel is not necessarily on their radar, if you will, in relationship to other things. And then now we're talking language. So I'm just wondering about those disconnects and wondering how David and Netta would respond.
Netta, go for it.
Okay. I mean, I was just going to say thank you, Nechama, for bringing these issues up. I guess, as David mentioned before, if we think about education as starting where students are at and then building towards something new, excuse me, I think trying to, if we acknowledge perhaps that for some students, Israel isn't something that resonates with them or that's on their radar in the ways that one might hope, let's find out what is on their radar and what they do care about, and then build towards connecting Israel to it, or whatever it is that they're interested in. So like David was mentioning, if they're interested in hip hop, or if they're interested in journaling and you think that that's connected with poetry, or they're interested in graphic design, or whatever the case is, then part of what they could look at is, let's look at graphic design in Israel. And then there's a way in, and then you get to websites, and so maybe there are ways that we don't just a priori say, well, one does or does not have a connection to this, but that we're inviting them in to make those connections. With that, they may do, we would see what they would do. But I think, I don't know very much about, if anything, about graphic design in Israel. So once you allow me to do a research project on that, there might be all kinds of interesting connections to be made. So I think it'd be very interesting to explore.
So I'm a student of, when I was doing I became a student of sociology. So I tried to look at like the sociology of the Jews, and shock horror, I discovered pretty early on in my studies that the Jews aren't only a religion. And actually, when I was studying Jewish teenagers, the language which they used to describe what being Jewish meant to them was not Catholic Protestant Jew. right? Which was the sociology that we grew up with in the 1950s, by the way, when many of these Hebrew schools were first developed. The language they were using to describe their ethnic identity with pride was that of ethnicity and race. The language they used resembled more like the Hispanic youth, the Asian youth, the African American youth in North America than it did other religious groups, which is interesting because they don't share the racial characteristics. But if people and young people start talking about their tribal affiliations, then all of a sudden language has to be part of that equation about ethnic pride. Because this is why Nechama's question is so important. The paradox of Gen Z and also millennials is that they're able to be both universalists and be citizens of the world, and they're simultaneously proud of being Jewish at the same time. And there's a real awakening in America today of that ethnic pride. In the Black community, the obvious example is Black Lives Matter, but we don't need to talk about that specifically, but that's a manifestation. Now there is, when you talk to many Jewish youth today, it's not just 93% of adults who are proud of being Jewish in the Pew study, it translates down almost every study down the ages. They might not show it in the same way their grandparents or parents exhibit their Jewishness, but they're still proud, and it's more than just bagels, and it's more than just, the Hanukkah puppy song, which, by the way, was a very interesting Hebrew linguistic experiment in and of itself. But I think that's the opening. The opening is not to treat our kids as either or, but to treat them as whole human beings, of which ethnic pride and Jewish pride is actually really high amongst many of our young people today, even if they don't express it the same way their parents or their grandparents did.
As we kind of bring our Sicha to a close, and I appreciate the the Avram Infeld reference, the David Diggs reference. There's a lot of richness here. I'm wondering, just for both of you who came into this conversation thinking about this, what was something you might have heard from the questions raised, from your own thinking, from what you heard from the other conversant, that really gives you a sense of there is what to move us forward. There is something that can really give us some hope about how we reframe Hebrew in these spaces and in the broader Jewish educational landscape.
I think what David was just sharing about the role of identity in all of our lives, but in young people's lives, and how they're thinking about themselves as both universalists and connected to a particular identity. I like exploring that, these notions around like intersectionality and like, what does it mean to be, someone who is Black and Jewish, and what does this mean, if you're trans and Jewish, all of these different connection points in a person's identity, and not making assumptions about a particular type of Jew and then, making our curriculum accordingly, but recognizing, as we've said many times, the complexity and the diversity, and acknowledging that, and then building our educational processes around that, I think is very, very rich and very exciting to conceptualize together.
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm really taking from Netta, and also having learnt along the way with Sharon as well, is that the Jews aren't unique in this one. That there are fields out there which can actually inform what we're actually talking about, and we can take advantage. We're not that special. No, we are special in so many ways, but that there are so many other groups that have spoken about language, and maybe we need to be really willing and open to accept that we are part of this broader constellation of cultures and tribes and ethnicities, and collectively language is important. I mean, many have argued that without it, societies and civilizations will fall apart. And therefore, when we're asking the question about what's the community we want to be living in, we have to decide what priority we want to give to Hebrew language. I think it has to be more than ideology. I think it has to be more than nostalgia. It has to be additive value. And I think that's a task for many people on the group. And I think that's the flip side to the question, Andrew, is like, what's the challenge? Is like, how do we get more people in this conversation? How do we champion and how do we advocate for? I mean, the good news is we have some people on this call who are literally meshugala davar about Hebrew language. That's their thing. But now we need to strategize on how we make that more pervasive in the community. Revolution starts somewhere. And maybe this is the beginning of a conversation, but we have to decide and we have to determine how it's going to be prioritized moving forward. And we have to keep asking ourselves the question of like, what's the value add? I don't necessarily like living in a consumer society where every question has to be what's the value add, but we've chosen to live in this society for multiple reasons. And if we can't answer the question, what value does Hebrew language add to our people, then it's a lost cause. But let's articulate it, let's get it out there, and let's work together to make this thing happen, because it's a worthy and noble enterprise. I commend you all for being part of the conversation.
So I'm glad as the revolution was unfolding, we were all in the Zoom where it happened. Obviously, David, thank you so much for joining us. We at Hebrew at the Center so appreciate the partnership that we've been building with the Jewish Education Project, with you and with your team. Netta, thank you for helping us advance not only the research, but bringing these important concepts about the different ways in which language interconnects with a sense of community, with a sense of identity, giving us the kind of sophisticated thinking that will serve as some of the tools that we bring to the task that I think we all are trying to make happen. Thank you also to all of our participants. And with that, I'll turn it back to my friend and colleague, our board president, Arnie Winchell.
Arnie, can I say one thing before you do your final thing? Andrew asked us one question. I was going to slip it in somewhere. He asked us, what's our favorite Hebrew word?
I know, I wanted to add one too.
Okay.
Netta, what's your favorite Hebrew word?
Sorry. It's Natan, because it was my father's name, and it means he gave, and it's a palindrome, and it helps me learn Hebrew roots. So I had that one ready. So, thank you, David.
My favorite Hebrew word. I'm embarrassed to say it now that I've given it such a hype. Melafefon chamutz. I just love it. I don't know why. That word it always resonated with me. I love it. Anyway, thank you.
Oy, toda, todot. Well, I want to thank Netta, David, Andrew, all of you who joined us and participated this evening, to our co-sponsor, the Jewish Education Project. If you don't know much about the Jewish Education Project, then I would encourage you to log on to their new educator portal and to receive regular updates on the educational resources. I'll put it in the chat. And to learn more about Hebrew at the Center, also in the chat, is you can go to our website, HebrewAtTheCenter.org, where you can also view the recordings of previous Sicha programs and another series called Skira, in which Netta participated, also looking at some of the research related to Hebrew. We hope that you will join us on February 7th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time for the last Sicha in this series with Stuart Schaffman, journalist and translator, and Dr. Wendy Zerler, Sigmund Falk Professor of Modern Jewish Literature and Feminist Studies at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religions. They'll be discussing the art of translation of modern Hebrew language in literature, film, and television. Please feel free to reach out to any of us with ideas for future programming, and if you want to get more involved. And please spread the word among your family members, friends, and colleagues that, as David pointed out, Hebrew is cool and it belongs to all of us as members of the tribe. Erev Tov.